In the Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois eloquently penned, "Between me and the other world, there's an unasked question. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter around it. How does it feel to be a problem? How does it feel not to just have a problem, but to be the problem? That your very existence, the fact that you are breathing, is problematic. The usual suspect, gunned down in the streets holding Skittles and tea, memorialized on Twitter in rest in peace shirts and hashtags, all while they continue to make toe tags. How does it feel to be a problem? How does it feel to know that 32% of Black males live in poverty? How does it feel to know that Black and brown boys are expelled faster than any other race? How does it feel to scream at the top of your lungs and feel like no one hears you? A problem is often seen as something negative, unwelcomed, harmful, and needing to be dealt with. But a problem can also be defined as an unexpected disruption in a system. So my answer to the question, how does it feel to be a problem, is that I was born to be a problem. You were not created just to get along. The blood that flows through your veins is the same blood that beats through the hearts of men and women that were a problem. People that were born to disrupt the system, that challenged the status quo. People that dared to believe that this world could be different. You see, Frederick Douglass was a problem. Harriet Tubman was a problem. Nat Turner was a problem. Fannie Lou Hamer was a problem. Martin Luther King was a problem. Marcus Garvey was a problem. Malcolm X was a problem. Assata Shakur was a problem. Barack Obama is a problem. Mike Brown was a problem that shook a sleeping nation to a movement. You see, Sadiqa Reynolds is a problem. Anthony Smith is a problem. Owsley Brown and Sarah Harris is a problem for having the audacity to believe that people from all around the world with different religions, different cultures, and different races could come together on one accord to speak truth to power. You see, you were born to be a problem. You were created to disrupt the system. You are here to challenge the status quo. You are designed to question those in authority, to ask the hard questions. Why are you afraid of my Blackness? Why does my wallet always seem to look like a gun? Why is it okay to take health care away from those that need it the most? Why are we abusing people that want to protect the right to have water? Why do women still get paid less than men for doing the same job? Why do 62 people hold as much wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion people in this world? Why does my zip code determine my life expectancy? Why do you incarcerate more Black and brown males than any other race? Why does the educational system expel us at an alarming rate? Why is the drug epidemic now a health crisis when it ravished through Black communities? Why can't I shop or eat a balanced meal in my own neighborhood? Why do you turn your backs on the very people whose backs you walked on to build this nation? Why does my existence threaten you? Your job is to ask why, because you were born to be a problem. You were born with possibility, power, promise, and potential. You were created to confront injustice, to be a thorn in the side of inequality. You were made to be a voice for the voiceless. You see, you be that glitch in the matrix. If you were not a problem, they wouldn't be after you so hard. If you were not a problem, they wouldn't create laws to hold you back. If you were not a problem, they wouldn't try to squash your dreams. If you were not a problem, they wouldn't try to beat you down. If you were not a problem, they wouldn't care about you organizing. If you were not a problem, they wouldn't infiltrate your community with drugs and alcohol. If you were not a problem, they wouldn't care that you stand up in your community. The reason they are after you is because they see your power. because strength always overpowers weakness. Light always outshines darkness. Didn't y'all hear Merton? Y'all are all walking around shining like the sun. So when they ask you, how does it feel to be a problem? You stand proud, stand strong, stand in your authority, and you say it feels amazing. Because I was born to be a problem. Thank you. Thank you.
You're third, you're last. So, yeah, you're
ready to run?
Good afternoon. When you hear your name in a poem, you deserve to take a moment to just breathe. I am Sadiqa Reynolds, and I am one of your moderators today. I'm here now to introduce Dr. Aruni Bhatnagar. Dr. Bhatnagar is a professor in the Institute of Molecular Cardiology at the University of Louisville. Bhatnagar's work led to the creation of the new field of environmental cardiology. He leads a group of 30 investigators focused on developing a better understanding of the cardiovascular complications of diabetes. Currently, Dr. Bhatnagar serves on the editorial boards of both Circulation Research and Circulation, has participated in over 50 National Institutes of Health review panels, and is the author of 120 publications. Dr. Bhatnagar. We're going to
introduce everybody first.
They will put the slides.
Okay.
We'll do them all at once.
Everybody at first.
I'll let Anthony introduce
See,
David Muhammad now.
he's ready to roll, right? So again, good afternoon. My name is Anthony Smith, and thank you, Hannah. It's good to be a problem. I don't think my mom thought that growing up, but right now it's good. So I have the pleasure of introducing David Muhammad. David Muhammad is a leader in the field of criminal justice, violence prevention, and youth development. He is the executive director of the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, where he serves as the lead consultant and technical assistance provider to the Sierra Health Foundation's Positive Youth Justice Initiative. David also provides leadership and technical assistance to Care Violence Reduction Strategy in the city of Oakland, California, and Stockton, California. And he also serves as a consultant for us at Cities United, helping us think about the national initiative to drastically reduce the homicide rate of African American men and boys. David Muhammad.
And finally, I will introduce to many here, probably those people actually not in this building, because certainly everybody here knows Congressman Yarmuth, but for those of us, those folks who are joining us electronically, I would introduce Congressman John Yarmuth. U.S. Representative John Yarmuth represents Kentucky's 3rd Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives. Now in his 6th term, Congressman Yarmuth serves as the top Democrat on the House Budget Committee. Is that correct? Yes. Congressman Yarmuth has been recognized for his work to improve education, expand access to affordable health care, and revitalize manufacturing in Louisville. Born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, Congressman Yarmuth graduated from Atherton High School and Yale University. He and his wife, Kathy, have one son, Aaron, who is owner and editor of Leo Weekly. And we have certainly all heard of Birth of a Nation. Sometimes it seems as though there is God, Congressman Yarmuth, and our attorneys generals between us and death of a nation. So we certainly do welcome him, welcome all of our speakers today. And so with that, yes. I would introduce and bring back the man who was born ready, Dr. Bhatnagar.
Okay, now. I have to find my clicker. Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here and glad for you to come here and be interested in something that is sort of sobering and important for all of us. And I want to start off with the background that is the stage for all of our lives currently, which are the major cities. They are cities have been developed over years to facilitate economic growth, social interactions, and general human flourishing. So what's the problem? The problem is that now that we have squeezed ourselves in these little spaces, that's bearing both on our mental and our physical and our spiritual health. Most importantly, it is sort of sequestering us into areas that are unnatural and, given our evolutionary past, sort of unconducive to our well-being and health. And in this sort of mega jungles, we see a rise of disease. And it's not only for people who live in these very large, big cities, but also people who are wanting to get in. As you can see, if you look at the global burden of disease, that rates of heart disease are climbing. This used to be a problem that was only prevalent in industrialized societies where people were more affluent and had more leisure time. But it's gradually creeping up in all parts of the world, and even developing countries now facing this brunt of a chronic disease burden now that we have conquered much of infectious diseases. So why is this happening? Why is it that we suddenly see this rise of these sort of chronic diseases around the world, and what is it that we can do about it? Maybe it is in some way linked to the environment that we are in, maybe the environment that we grow up and we live in, which is a complex mixture of our social, cultural, ecological, economic, and built environment that we have created around us is unnatural to us as humans that we have for so long evolved and developed into. The type of cognitive functions, the type of physiological activities that we have evolved and developed have depended upon our communication with nature and with elements of nature. And now we have created this artificial world around ourselves to which we are completely alienated from. So now we need to learn that maybe it is that living in these unconducive environments, maybe in dyssynchrony with the rhythms of the environment, the changes of the seasons, the circadian rhythms of night and day that we have so flagrantly overlooked and violated, maybe that's the reason that we have this increasing levels of sickness. And then a mismatch between our genes, that we have been adapted to a different environment from what we are in now. And so that is sort of bearing upon our health and the health of the well-being, and it has become increasingly difficult for us to maintain at least good health. We know that our children and our grandchildren will be the first generation since the Industrial Revolution who would have a shorter lifespan than we did. And that's because of the rise of chronic disease around the world. So how do we understand the environment? How do we look at it? When we could look at different components of the environment, there is the natural environment, which is the nights and day, the light, the greenery around us, the mountains, the nature itself. But we are sort of removed from that. We create around ourselves a social environment, which is in some sense was to make ourselves immune from nature, because we thought nature is nice and it's beautiful. The birds are good, it's very pretty and bucolic, but nature is also red in tooth and claw. Nature is not always conducive to human health. Nature is not something that is going to bend over and sort of let us be on our path. It treats us just like any other of its creations. And then to further sort of safeguard us against the social environment, we create small little personal environments around ourselves. And these environments also could have important bearing on health, our lifestyle choices, what we choose to eat, drink, or what we choose to do. All of these collectively bear upon our health. And components of these environments then would be important in our physical well-being, our mental well-being, as well as our spiritual well-being. But most of the components of these environments that we cannot alter. One general thing that we share with everyone else, especially living in urban environments, is the problem of air pollution, which I studied nearly for the last 10 or 15 years. And this the problem of the environment is pervasive. Around the world, 7 million people die prematurely because of heart disease and facing high levels of air pollution. Even in the United States, where we think the air is clean, 220,000 people die every year. And this problem is related to the development of chronic disease, that we have created this artificial environment around us that not only sort of stunts our well-being, but also creates disease and misery in the world. And most of the major burden of this pollution is heart disease. And coming back to home, we were asked to talk about Kentucky. So as you can see, if you look at the levels of air pollution around the country, it is right in the heart of the Ohio Valley that we see one of the highest levels of pollution in the country. It's like a wound in the heart of the nation. This is where all this pollution that comes from the East Coast, downwind from Chicago, accumulates and leads to very high levels of what we call small particulate air pollution. And that has important bearing on the health, not only of our people, but also of our children and of our environment. And so we can see that this would lead to not only local changes, but also global changes. What is happening here is not unique to us, it's happening around the world. I'm sure you heard stories about China and India and how those countries are facing this enormous burden of air pollution, which is leading to a sort of a change in the climate of the world and has effects worldwide. And these effects have led to an increase in the progressive increase in the temperature of the planet for the last 30 years. And every year, we have exceeded the bounds of natural variability. And we have been unable to contain this increase in the temperature of the Earth. It may be a slight increase, but it makes a big difference. Accompanied with that, we have been spewing out huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that's nothing new. The planet has seen this before. We've had carbon dioxide production whenever there are volcanoes and eruptions and meteors hit the planet. We had these huge jumps in carbon dioxide, right? But we have never seen this before. Since 1950, we have seen this level that the planet has never experienced. And now this is going to continue to increase unless we do something drastic, unless we change and doing things as business as usual, we are not going to be able to contain this problem. All of this has happened since the pre-industrial time. And you can see that because of this, there is this widespread pollution. In the Mediterranean, the levels of ozone have doubled over the few years. And this is suffocating the plant life and animal life. If you go to the coral reefs, you will find that the huge levels of coral have been bleached, and they're all as pale as death. And if you look at the Indian Ocean, you can see that black carbon and soot have covered most of the country so that the plant life cannot breathe, and that there is a constant haze of brownness over the continent. I had a story from a friend of mine, and he said he went to school children in India and asked them to make a landscape. They painted the sky brown because they've never seen blue skies. And this permanent haze that surrounds us is stifling. In China, because nobody's ever seen a real sunrise, a clear, clean sunrise, they install large, huge television sets in the Tiananmen Square so people can see what a sunrise looks like. So this is what we've done to our Earth. If you go around in the northern and the southern hemisphere, you won't find 1 square mile of pristine Earth left, either in the northern or the southern hemisphere. And the largest brunt of this is to be paid by the small developing countries in Africa or the large countries in China. They were not the ones to make the pollution, but they are to bear the burden. So what's the solution? We have to address this big disparity of wealth, where a few people in the world have enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of power. And we can see this rising. This is just between our lifetime. This is during our watch. We can see that from 2000 to 2020, that the top 1% have as much wealth as the bottom 99%. So what's the answer? The answer is that we need to understand other people who are also like us. We need to understand that there is not just, what we can impart is not just pity, but compassion. So what does that mean? We wanted to unpack that word. And we get this word from an old Indian ideas. And one of the idea is that how can one be compassionate? And there's a famous poem, this is one of the texts from India, it's called the Upanishads. And what it says was, there was a little child who went to his father and asked, "Who am I?" And the father said that if you look in the mountains and you see the sunrise of the mountain, that's what you are. If you look at the river flowing to the mountains, that's what you are. You are the birds that sing, you are the flowers that bloom, that's what you are. So the point of compassion is to realize that there is no difference between self and others, that the others are as precious and important as us. And the others are not just persons, but also the planet, the flowers, the animals. And so as you realize that we are all part of this oneness, that is where the indication of what being compassionate means, is to be able to understand that there is unity in all of our living, and that we are part of this wonderful world and this little blue planet that we call home. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Aruni. Are there any immediate reactions from the other panelists, reflections?
Well, for me, I would say one that was jarring, right, to look at that research. It was also that you were so great on your time, but intimidating.
That clock, right? You got to live up to that, David, just so that you know.
Right, exactly. But you know, I don't know if it's this level of depth or in the weeds research. I've just been struck by this change in cities. So you started off with cities, right? So there was this great flight from cities, from the middle class and wealthy, mostly white, and there's a reversal now, right? So you have communities and poor communities of color going to the suburbs, and this more affluent white population coming back to the cities all over America. And I don't know if you've looked at that and its effect on communities.
Right, so the American cities are organized a bit different from the rest of the world, and it has been a movement in the last few years to get people back into the city and living in a way that is most efficient. And you hear this often, that there are lots of people in the world, it's teeming with people. But if you put people, and if they live like people live in New York City, everybody in the planet could fit into a space that would be less than the state of Texas, and you'll have still room to spare. So it's not so much that the cities create problems, they are very efficient. They bring people together. I think, and there is something of magic that happens in cities, that only cities like Athens and Florence and New York can reach the epitome of civilization. But we have to invent a new way of living in cities, a way that is cleaner and safer and compassionate and is equitable, so that all members could find a way to live in the cities and interact with each other.
Thank you.
So I had one question on the slide where you had the 5, like the heart disease, and number 2 was unintentional injuries.
Yes.
Can you give a little bit of what that looks like? Because in my mind, I'm thinking, because I do violence prevention work, is any of that tied to, because I know lead has a correlation and stuff like that, so.
Right, so these are environmental burden of disease. So most of the time there is a sort of untoward effect of the environment. It relates to cardiovascular or cardiac deaths. But the number 2 was unintentional injuries, which means like, there was a leakage from a power plant, there was a poisoning of the river, the Flint, Michigan episode, and all these diseases that come out because we are not deliberately trying to hurt anybody, but we are careless in the way we are running the world.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah. Well, my only comment, since I have to talk about the budgetary implications of this, is that what's very clear is that a great deal of the cost of our budget, particularly in the federal government, is attributable to things that we don't price into the budget, which brings up the whole argument of carbon taxes and so forth. And so it sets the framework very well for the debates that we're having now, and we'll have many more in the future. Yeah.
And we hope some people are receptive to these ideas.
Well, Dr. Bhatnagar, I want to thank you for this comment, this quote that I will forever use now, a wound in the heart of the nation. And I think that's what we need to remember as we think about how to plan as we move forward. And I just, with the last minute, if you could just sort of talk to us about, give me one thing that we could do here in Louisville that might change this wound in the heart of our nation.
Just one word, education.
No. There you go.
We need to, so education is first the realization of a problem, then an understanding of the problem, and the third is search for a solution to the problem. We need to have our youth educated, involved into our communities. We need to make them realize that this is home and this is what we belong. I travel everywhere, talk to everyone, and people say that you're from Kentucky. Look what it is. Why are you not, people not doing anything? Little they realize that the problem is so enormous that we cannot address all the dimensions of the problem. But to start with, I think if we have better education and people are more involved in the communities, that we might be able to find our own solutions. We're not looking for pity or handouts or some other force to come and sort of rescue us from our mess, but we have to find our own solutions locally.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So next, we'd like to invite David Muhammad to come and share his remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
First, I want to say I am incredibly thankful to be here in Louisville and the invitation from the Festival of Faith. I'm honored to be here at this great city. So again, thank you. I'm going to talk about the costs of mass incarceration. So first, I want us to consider 15-year-old Johnny. Right? So consider 15-year-old Johnny, who, when he was 3 years old, his parents were divorced, and he never saw or heard from his father since he's been 5. And his mother is suffering from drug addiction, and his mother is in an abusive relationship, and he's witnessed his mother beaten by her boyfriend, and that same boyfriend has also abused Johnny. Recently, Johnny's best friend was shot and killed right in front of him. And a few weeks later, full of that pain and that trauma, Johnny made a bad decision. He went downtown, he pushed a man to the ground and took his briefcase. Johnny's now being charged with strong armed robbery. As a society, what should we do with Johnny? What is the appropriate response to hold accountable, but also heal the harm? That was done in an incident, but that is really about the larger trauma that Johnny has experienced. Should we simply punish the behavior and punish the child, or should we address the underlying trauma that produced the behavior? In America, we have decided to simply punish. We've decided to cause more trauma in the way we punish, and those decisions are extraordinarily costly. We have become the mass incarcerator of the world by far, and we are suffering from it, both economically, but also the wounds and the human toll and costs. This is the whole pie of incarceration. The more than 2 million people incarcerated all over the country in various forms, state prisons, local jails, federal prisons, juvenile facilities, immigration facilities, all over the country, mass incarceration. This is young people incarcerated in America versus other countries. This should embarrass us. This is after there's been a reduction in youth incarceration in this country. This is what it looks like in terms of race and ethnicity. For every 100,000 white youth in America, 31 are detained. For every 100,000 black youth in America, 168 are detained. Though young people commit delinquent acts at about the same rate. The justice system, evidence proves, this is not only my opinion, but this is backed up by research and studies, is ineffective, harmful, and excessively expensive. It does not work, it causes harm, and it costs too much. This is one of many studies. This larger slide deck has several studies in it, but this is just one slide. This was a more recent study that looked at thousands of cases across the country. And it also controlled for other factors like poverty and poor educational outcomes. It looked at just the effect of the system involvement in and of itself. And it said young people who are involved in the juvenile justice system have huge decreases in the likelihood of high school completion and large increases in the likelihood that they'll be incarcerated as an adult. That's the effect that just the system involvement in and of itself has on them. And it's also incredibly expensive. A recent study by the Justice Policy Institute showed nationally, on average, to incarcerate a single young person each year is about $150,000. In California, where I'm from, an incarcerated adult every year, it's $62,000 a year. Incredibly expensive. So, that's the justice system. But we're also talking about violence and the loss of life. Every single shooting where someone is injured costs upwards and surpassing $1 million per shooting. When you take into account fire department response, ambulance response, police department response, a hospitalization, an investigation, a trial, an incarceration, sometimes an autopsy, and if there's a homicide, all of those costs add up, direct costs of $1 million each injury shooting. When you look at the indirect costs, the loss of work from either the perpetrator or the victim, you add up more millions of dollars. Now, how should we reform the system? One, reduce its size. Let's stop, quite simply, messing with people. All of these arrests for marijuana possession, for illegal tickets on the bus or the train, turnstile jumping as they call it in New York City, open containers, riding your bicycle on the sidewalk. We're talking millions of arrests across the country for these ridiculous offenses. Let's reduce the size of the system. And then for people who are a legitimate risk to the public safety, where we need to do something with, let's improve the outcomes of those individuals by doing something, by operating the system in a very different way. But if we significantly reduce the size of the system, based upon the cost, we would have a lot of savings. And let's reinvest that money back into the communities that are suffering the biggest from crime and incarceration. So in America, every single year, we spend $80 billion a year on incarceration. And that doesn't include community corrections of probation and parole or trial system, $80 billion just on incarceration. Every single shooting, as we talked about, $1 million. So let's think back about Johnny. How better could we spend $80 billion in this country, rather than on something that's ineffective, harmful, and obviously excessively expensive? There are programs that cost, on their high end, $25,000 a year. On the low end, as low as $5,000 a year, that we have a lack of political will to spend on Johnny because of how he looks and where he comes from. So here are 4 ideas, that more than ideas, they're programs that have been effective around the country to reduce violence. Ideas that we can reinvest such money. Group violence reduction strategy. We will identify the individuals who are most very highly at risk of being involved in violence. We inform them of their risk. Not just simply sit back and wait until they do something and lock them up. We tell them ahead of time, an early warning system. And we inform them of their risk, and then we invite them and offer services, supports, and opportunities. And when enforcement is needed, it's very focused, very tightly, laser-sharp focused on the violence. Hospital-based response. When people are shot, we go to the hospital to engage them, to offer support to them and their family and their friends. Studies have shown people who are shot become the highest risk population of people to be shot. So if we can both stop a potential retaliation, but also engage that individual so they aren't re-victimized. Third, this very innovative program out of the city of Richmond, California, the Office of Neighborhood Safety Peacemaker Fellowship. Similar idea of identifying the highest risk individuals. They said in this small city of 100,000, there are 25 people causing 80% of the gun violence. My colleague and friend, I had the pleasure of helping to create this office, and my colleague runs it now, and he created this fellowship, and he heard these law enforcement agencies say only 25 young men were responsible for 80% of the violence, and he invited those young men to a meeting. Crazy idea. They showed up. He explained to them their risk. And before they left, he said, lift up. They had name tags, and they made them feel important, because they are. And under that name tag, at the end of the meeting, he had a $1,000 check for each of them. Got their attention. But he also, more importantly, connected them to what we would call a credible messenger, someone who had experienced what they've experienced, but turned their lives around, is from their neighborhood, who can be a mentor to them, who can help them make better decisions. And that developed into what we call the Peacemaker Fellowship that has been extraordinarily effective and successful in Richmond. People complain you're giving, $9,000 because you can earn $1,000 a month for 9 of the 18-month fellowship. You're giving $9,000 to people who are shooters. If we can, even if you don't care about the compassion part of it, if we can give you $9,000 to stop a $1 million shooting, that was economically viable. That was fiscally smart. Lastly, cure violence, violence interruption, to use these credible messengers to canvass the neighborhoods hardest hit by crime and violence, to engage with folks who are on the street, to engage with those high-risk individuals, to help them turn their lives around, and to connect them to service and supports and opportunities that build on their strengths and address their needs. If we do this for Johnny, rather than locking him up, making him worse, further traumatizing him, holding him accountable, have him sit down with that victim and have that victim explain to him the trauma that he experienced for being knocked down and having his briefcase taken, which never happens in traditional criminal justice setting. But in a restorative process, to hear from that victim and then provide the type of trauma-informed services and positive youth development that Johnny needs, we can change his life around before he becomes an inmate that does worse. We know what works, we know what does not work. And like we tell young people, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. Let's do something different. Thank you.
Good job, David. And so let's ask for any thoughts from anybody now reflecting
So
on
I know
that.
your 4 items there were related to gun violence.
Yes.
You didn't have anything to do with drug policy.
Yeah. If I can get another 20 minutes, I'll try. So that is a deep and difficult piece, right? So, the easy part on drug policy is incarceration really doesn't work. Right, and we can make an argument that people who are a risk to the public safety in terms of violence might need some sort of time out of the community, right? We need to change what that looks like, but we can agree that there needs to be something. For drug policy, my state, California, passed Prop 36. There's a new Prop 36, but an older Prop 36 that said you don't go to jail, you go to treatment. We forgot to pay for it, so it didn't happen. But that policy, right, instead of doing something like a social impact bond or a pay for success project where you stand up something that's effective and then you collect the savings, right? So if we stopped incarcerating people because they have a drug addiction and treated it like it is, which is a public health challenge, but we took the savings from the reduction in incarceration and reinvested it in effective treatments, then we would have a win-win. Right? We would be able to pay for something and stop the cycle of abuse. But we have to be patient. Drug addiction is very difficult. I think that with the new opioid explosion, we're now finding a little compassion because it looks a little different as different communities. And if we had that same type of compassion for all drugs, but it is difficult. And I think that we're seeing in states that have legalized marijuana, we're seeing that they're not burned to the ground. And we're seeing quite an increase in tax revenue, right, that can go to pay for effective programming.
But I think your point about the reinvestment of those dollars, I think that's one that is really going to be key. And I also think we have to think about the cost. So with this heroin epidemic, for example, we have in our own community some instances where you have folks that are being revived twice in a day because of the heroin overdoses. And so I think it is so important for us to continue to say what you've said, which is when crack was ravishing the black community and we were begging and saying that this was a public health epidemic and people were being penalized and it was criminalized, and now that there is a different face, suddenly we are as a country realizing that we have a public health problem. And so we should hold on to these lessons as we move forward in the future, because what we really do need is a way to deal with these things that does reflect the compassion that I'm sure is within all of us. And so I appreciate you saying
No, absolutely. And we have the Congressman here. I remember watching the movie Charlie Wilson's War. I think and so the Congressman from Texas who fought just to get some defense in Afghanistan against the Russian war there. And he fought for a long time and ended up getting millions and millions of dollars in defense to be spent for the local Afghanistan population. And at the end of the movie, when they won, they beat Russia. Who could believe that this tiny nation with no sophistication was able to beat Russia in a war? At the end of the movie, he said, okay, now let's get some money for education. And they were like, oh, please, right? And so we'll spend these millions of dollars on weaponry and defense. But I think he couldn't get $100,000 for schools, right, which we're now paying for there. And I think it's similar to this notion of reinvestment, that we'll spend $80 billion a year on incarceration, but can we spend $25,000 on Johnny to have the type of program that he needs? And this is education the community needs to have so that there is political will.
Yeah, and so just to bring some of this back to Louisville and Kentucky, right? The last numbers I looked at, Louisville has experienced 85 shootings this year, and that includes 33 homicides. Right, so do the math. David gave us the numbers, right? That's $85 million. And I don't know if any of you all have looked at the frontline video around Beecher Terrace, and it was called Prison State. And it talked about that we as Kentucky spend $15 million a year locking up people in and around that community, right? So when we start talking about the cost, and what we could do different, it's actually real here too, right? These are numbers that impact us on the day-to-day, that if we thought about prevention and intervention differently and supported that, what kind of outcomes would Louisville have and what would be different in our city? So I just wanted to bring it back home for you all so that we can keep track of what we're doing here locally and in the state.
And another thing, and this is important, Anthony, that you said prevention and intervention, because they are two different things. So on the prevention side, what we don't see enough of is the investment in education or in the job connections. And that is, most people who are killing people are not employed. And so when people come into places like the Urban League and other organizations, they are desperate immediately to have employment. And when we don't have those immediate answers, that creates significant problems. And we all meet and we talk a lot about what we'd like to change, but what we don't see is the investment follow the conversation. And that is, so with, you said $189,000 or something like that, we're incarcerated. It was
for young people, $150,000 a year.
So with $150,000 a year, we could probably place 200 people in jobs. Right. That's but we just won't, if you ask for that to put people in jail, you can get it. So if you say we need $200,000 for the jail, absolutely. If you say, could you give me $200,000 to help with job placement and wraparound services, Well, we'll give you 10,000. So I think those are the kinds of things that we have to be willing to talk about, and then the intervention is a whole different thing.
And just to quickly, you
We're
made
gonna
a
wrap
great
up.
point of prevention and intervention are different and separate. We need both.
Yes.
Right, but we also need to understand, and for local politicians sometimes it's difficult because we got to stop gun violence this year. We're going to do a mentoring program for middle school students, right? That action doesn't get you that goal, right? We need to do mentoring for middle school students.
Absolutely.
That is a prevention and a enrichment and development program. An intervention that's going to stop gun violence in the next 12 months looks a lot different.
And now, well, thank you
Thank
you
you,
all
thank
for
you.
that wonderful discussion. And now we will hear from Congressman John Yarmuth.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you. It's a great honor to be part of this program and, as always, to be part of the Festival of Faith, and I thank all those connected with that. When I heard the term sacred wisdom and I started thinking about the federal budget, I thought I was in the wrong place. Still think so. And by the way, I just want to say something to you, David. And since when did gun violence, the way you talked about it, become a partisan issue?
Right.
Unfortunately, at the federal level it has, and at the state level in many cases. That's not what I'm going to talk about. So I've always thought that government was the way we organize our responsibilities to each other. That's my definition of government. And so you might think that's a way to express the sense of compassion. We do have responsibilities to each other. Part of that's to be compassionate. A month ago, the Trump administration presented a budget for what we call the non-defense discretionary part of the budget. That's everything that is not mandatory spending. So it's everything but Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the interest on the debt. And there are a few other mandatory programs too, but those are things that programs and expenses over which the Congress has no control. We're talking about basically $1 trillion, half of which roughly is the defense budget and half of which is everything else that we spend. So I started thinking about the rest of the budget. And we tend to write it off just saying, the Republicans like to call it entitlements, as if people didn't pay into Social Security and Medicare all their entire lives and have some expectation of return on what they paid in. But I started thinking about it in a different way. If you think about Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, that's the compassion part of the budget. That's the part of the budget in which we collectively said, we want people to have dignity in retirement. We want people to have health care, whether they're low income or whether they turn 65, whether they're senior citizens. And when you think about the budget in the terms of the compassion part of the budget versus the other stuff, it actually ends up that the compassion part of the federal budget is, at least the way I calculate it, $2.5 trillion out of the $3.7 trillion we spend every year. That's a pretty compassionate society. Now, a month ago, when the Trump administration submitted their budget for that $1 trillion, they were advocating a $54 billion increase in defense spending and a $54 billion cut in what we call non-defense discretionary spending, or the discretionary compassionate spending. So in that category are things like community development block grants, which include programs like Meals on Wheels, school lunch programs, veterans health programs, housing, education, virtually everything else we do. And Mick Mulvaney, who's the new director of the Office of Management Budget, when justifying cutting all of the funding out for community development block grants, so all Meals on Wheels funding would go away, and all school lunch programs would go away, and after-school programs. And he said, we didn't see any evidence that those programs make a difference. As if keeping people alive was not an adequate justification for a program. But he's actually even wrong, because when you start calculating, as both of everybody on the panel is doing, is there are economic trade-offs and economic benefits to doing this kind of thing. If you keep a senior citizen in his or her home because somebody's delivering a meal to them every day and they don't need to go into an institution, for several dollars a day, you are saving the overall system about $60,000 a year if they were to be institutionalized. So there is a real economic aspect to compassion within the budget. And unfortunately, the way our budget process works, we don't get to make the kind of investments that a lot of us do want to make because of the following. And I'm going to get a little bit in the weeds, procedural weeds here, but it's really important to understand. So if we want to create a new program, or if we want to increase funding for an existing program, we have to get a score from the Congressional Budget Office. That score basically says, what is the impact of this new expense on the deficit? And obviously, if you're putting money out immediately, and it's going to add to the deficit, right? That's simple math. Well, what we have a debate on now is whether or not the Congressional Budget Office should use something called dynamic scoring. And dynamic scoring says is you make an expense and there is a return on that investment, and that should be counted when you're talking about the impact on the budget, because we also have pay-go rules which say if you're going to add something because of increased expense, you're going to add to the deficit, you have to find an offset somewhere else, or you can't do it. Okay? So if there's no return on the investment and it's just outgoing money, then you're going to have a hard time getting that passed in the Congress. If we had had those rules in place after World War II, we would not have been able to pass the GI Bill. The GI Bill returned $7 for every one to the Treasury, ultimately, not to speak of all the human benefit that it provided and the society-wide benefit that it provided in creating essentially a strong middle class after World War II and going forward. So right now we have a debate, and this is as partisan as I'll get, probably. So the Republicans say they want to use dynamic scoring on taxes, on tax cuts. So they passed a rule, they were in charge, so they passed a rule saying CBO can use dynamic scoring on tax cuts. Their theory being, if you cut taxes, it supposedly stimulates growth, additional income, and therefore you get the offset for the loss of revenue. Now, that hadn't really played out that way, but anyway, they want to use dynamic scoring that way. We say, what about the value of investments long term? What about the value of feeding a child, making sure that that 4-year-old actually has the well-being to be able to learn at school, so that child is not illiterate, and therefore, David, it becomes a statistic that in California they use childhood literacy rates to project prison cell needs down the road. So what is the value of that, feeding that child, educating that child? What is the value of medical research that we know is going to create benefits maybe 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, but we can't count that in our budget process. That's very, very unfortunate. But that's what we're dealing with in Washington right now. Compassion can be economically beneficial, and neglect can be costly. And I think that's the debate we need to have on a kind of an abstract basis in this country, and not debating over individual programs when those individual programs can either be minimized, kind of mocked in many cases. We're having a debate now over whether to cut out all funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. And you add all of them up, the annual funding for all of them, and they just about match the spending for military bands. Wow. But there's no debate on whether we should have military bands. And And I think this is actually a healthy debate, because when you threaten the life of those programs which bring joy and cultural enrichment and in a lot of cases economic benefits to communities throughout the country, people start to understand how important they are when they're threatened. So I'm not really agonizing over this debate right now. It's also this budget's not going to be achieved and implemented, so I'm not particularly fearful. But we've talked about a lot of these things, but those are the things that we debate every day. We used to have debates over whether or not a particular issue or a program should be a federal program or a state initiative, or whether that to be. Now we have debates over whether compassion is really justified, and that's scary. And I think that's a bad trend, and we need to correct that. But I just want to talk about one little positive incident. I'm right at my end of my time. But here's how compassion, in an environmental sense, can be incredibly important in so many ways, and positive and economically beneficial. Chicago has just agreed to a contract to replace every street light in the city. It's 270,000 street lights with modern, energy-efficient lighting. It's going to save the city. Well, it's about a $160 million project. It'll take 4 years. It pays for itself in about that same amount of time, and obviously yields benefits economically to the city going forward. But they're doing all these other cool things. Because of technology, they have sensors. They're going to have sensors in these lights, which, unfortunately, because of the need, will sense when a gunshot goes off. Law enforcement can respond immediately. It will have sensors that will tell you when snow has piled up on the street below it at a level at which it has to be plowed, saving the city all sorts of money and creating efficiencies throughout the system. And there are all these other applications that they're thinking about doing. So I think we're on the verge of a lot of really creative thinking about how compassion can also be incredibly economically beneficial to society, and we all ought to be focused on that. Thank you.
As always, thank you, Representative Yarmuth. We always enjoy having you here. And everybody on this panel except for David happens to be Louisville-based. And it's just, he's moving to Louisville. See what happens in one day? You get him in one. So let's do some quick reflections, reactions to Congressman Yarmuth. Yep.
So the big question is that we know that there are these problems with climate change, and there are these changes that are globally affecting everyone. And we as scientists struggle to convey the importance of the problem or to convince a large group of people about the reality or the veracity of our findings. And so we wonder sometimes that maybe it's a difference in language, that maybe we are not speaking the right language, and that we are somehow inept in our expression of the problem, or that we have boxed ourselves in such a way that we appear to be a special interest group that are sort of just vying for their own turf, rather than have this larger view of what we have done to this planet and what will happen if we do not wake up. So what do you think is the solution? How can we reach out to the other side and sort of make some headway into that fortress?
Well, I don't think it's a question of language. I know we can debate over whether it's climate change or global warming or whatever, and that's for talk show hosts and so forth. That's not really important. I think people get the idea. I think what we're seeing with regard to climate change is the same phenomenon we saw with Donald Trump's election. It's a part of society rebelling against the elites, the people who think they're superior to them. And we want to tell them how they should change their life and so forth. It's not a rational analysis on the part of the people who are deniers or so forth, who don't think it's a critical situation. I think it's, again, this rebellion against somebody else with better degrees than they have, no pun intended, telling them what to do.
If I can ask, there was a lot of hope prior to this administration, a bipartisan approach to criminal justice reform, and even your colleague in Congress from Kentucky may have some other ideas we don't agree with, but he joined with Senator Booker to put forward a criminal justice reform plan, legislation, and it seems like with the current Attorney General and others that we're going backwards. And so I wonder what you see from Congress.
It's really a shame. He's talking about Rand Paul, who's been very, very good on this issue. And no, Rand's been really, really good on criminal justice reform. At the end of the last Congress, we had the perfect environment to get something done on criminal justice reform, significant bipartisan interest. And I think in the final analysis, it was, and I'll get a little bit partisan here, don't give Democrats anything to talk about during the election, any positive. It was a tactical electoral strategy and not a substantive decision. And it's really a shame because it's going to be a while before the environment's there. I was hoping that President Trump would say, why not start out my administration doing something that can be bipartisan and sets the right tone? That would have been a perfect opportunity. He didn't do it. Now we're probably in the situation you described.
Hey, anytime I see you, Congressman, I'm always thinking about how we can, because I know how much you care about compassion and policy. And I think we don't think enough about that as a community, as a country. And so we create programs sometimes that have compassion and they may or may not last, but we don't really reflect and look at the policies that are broken that create the need for the program. And I like to give people this example, and you reminded me because you talked about snow, and snow always makes me think of this. So I think we here in Louisville remember the huge snow and the roads shut down, maybe like 93 or something, maybe early 94. And now, when we have snowfall, there's always these snow plows are out, and the goal is to get it off the roads, clear the streets. And we're doing that for the people in cars, right? We want to make sure that our businesses aren't shut down, particularly UPS. You want to make sure they can get those packages out. And so all of that snow gets plowed off to the sides. And that's great. And you think about that and for the cars. But I sat at the light on Shelbyville Road with the Wendy's on my left and Oxmoor Mall on my right and saw a woman trying to maneuver over the hump in the snow in her wheelchair that the snow plows had created. And I watched her almost tip over in that wheelchair. And the snow plowers had done their job. They had cleared the streets, but really with no thought to what that cut in the sidewalk is there for. Because when you have the privilege of driving or walking, you don't even think about why the sidewalk goes down at the end. And compassion is more to me than just jumping out of your car and helping this lady that you don't know over the hump and over to the bus stop. Compassion is then looking into the policy that created the situation for the snow plowers to move that snow in such a way that she had a problem in the first place. We have got to begin to have compassion in how we move and change and think about policy implementation. Thank you. So we must remember, and I always get this from you, the key is it's more than just paying for the program. It is the policy that is breaking the backs of the people in our country that we have to daily protest and protect and figure out.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're gonna take a quick minute to do a quick stretch, right? A minute, y'all, so I want y'all to stand up. And just stretch however you feel. Touch your toes.
I wish I could do that.
Yeah, hurry.
Stretch your arms out. Close your eyes and breathe, however that helps you.
If there are cameras on, turn them off.
Oh, so you too.
Okay. I don't have my timer, so I'm lost. It's like
I have a microphone on.
What do you think is going to happen on Monday? We just have another continued resolution.
Oh my God. Are we doing all right? Is this entertaining?
Tuesday, we come in Tuesday.
Staff-
Yeah, Tuesday, yeah.
It's not entertaining you?
6:30 at
Are we
night.
ready?
Me either.
We just got a huge notice.
all right, can I get everybody back? We've got a quick video. Faces of compassion.
My name is Ebony O'Ray, and I am a community lover at heart, and that plays out in many different ways. I'm a program officer on the Mission and Impact team at the Community Foundation of Louisville. I honestly believe that I got to where I am today because of my education. So I focus a lot on educating others about access to school, doing good in school, and making sure that they understood that was a path to success. It's all about the resources that are available and people knowing about those resources so that they can actually access them. Nativity Academy is a very small, private middle school. Right now we're servicing 5th through 8th grade students. I sit on the board here at Nativity, and one unique thing about this particular middle school is that it services predominantly African American and Hispanic students. Who I am and how I've come to this place is definitely no coincidence. I feel like it's been orchestrated for me to have the life that I've led in order to be able to inform and instruct and advise people on a potential path to happiness. I think, and that's the definition of compassion, right? You see somebody suffering and you wanna help them not suffer. You see someone who doesn't have something and you want to act. You want to make sure that they have what they need. And so all of my life is really about giving somebody what I see they need or what they might tell me they need, and if I can't, connecting them to someone or some resources that possibly can.
We gonna set them free, yeah, yeah. Set me free, yeah, yeah. I said,
All right.
There's not a lot of support for cutting edge.
Good to hear that.
And I believe we have Ebony O'Ray in the audience, so if you see her, you guys just stop by and say hi to her. I think she's somewhere.
All right, so I think now what we will do is have a little discussion here between us and the question and answer, I think, from the audience as well. Is that correct? I think there's some microphones somewhere, if I am correct.
At the top
yes,
of
they
these two
are.
steps,
They're at
yep.
the top. Perfect.
Yep.
And so I would invite anyone who has a question to come forward, but I will ask each of the panelists just to think about first alternative visions of economic models. An alternative vision of economic models. So whatever that means to you, what does that bring up in your spirit? And if you would just give us a couple of minutes each, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. David, we'll start.
Yeah, sure. I have, in my other life, I'm going to be an economist. That's what I want. But I haven't. So I have that interest, not knowledge, interest. But so I want to give a specific answer. And I mentioned earlier this notion of social impact bond or pay for success, and SIB or social impact bond, which kind of grew out of London with this notion of, you all say prevention is more effective and less costly than deep in government intervention. And most deep in government intervention, hospitalization, institutionalization, incarceration is expensive, harmful, and ineffective, right? And so if we can prevent that from happening, we could stop a bad thing from happening and save a lot of money. And so the problem is always this street light example, which I thought was great from Chicago, of it's going to cost $140 or $160 million, and their return is pretty quick for 4 years. Or this GI Bill example, that there's a lack of will or a lack of vision in government to do something like that. And so in London, they said, all right, we're going to pay up front for people coming home because there was a huge recidivism rate, the rate upon which people return to prison. We're going to pay up front for an intervention it's going to be effective to reduce the number of people who return. And we have the number of beds, projections, that if we reduce that, we'll capture those savings and reinvest it back into this program. And it's shown effects. And so there's been some pilots in America, in New York, with Mayor Bloomberg and other places. The state of Massachusetts has done one. The implementation has not been, the term has been changed to pay for success. And so what we've done in America, instead of reinvesting the savings, we've just put money up and said, if you reach this outcome, we'll pay you for your success, which is a great way to do contracting. I actually think it's good. But what's better is, if I have an effective program that really reduces the number of people that goes to county jail here, and then we should be able to reduce the sheriff's budget, right? The problem is the sheriff's political power will say that, nope, you're not going to reduce my budget, right? And so, but if we had a different vision to say, we will reduce foster care placements, we will reduce, in Fresno, California, there's a version of this that they're looking at asthma hospitalizations, that they realize if we just had somebody go visit these children who are high risk to come back into the hospital, right, which costs less money than hospitalization, we can reduce hospitalization, but somebody had to pay for it up front and then later get the savings and reinvest it. If we did that to foster care, to incarceration, to hospitalization, it's a different way. This dynamic scoring, it could be a return on investment.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other challenges with that pay-for-success model, and I love it, I love social impact bonds, pay for success. I think what we don't understand is that the need is so great, we're not taking care of everybody anyway.
That's right.
So once you make space, if I can give you these 10 people, I've got 10 people on the waiting list. So that's why it is imperative that we deal with the policy, which is creating the need for the program. You really, they must go hand in hand. And so I ask you now, Congressman Yarmuth, just to talk with us a little bit about alternative visions of economic models.
Well, since you dealt with criminal justice system, I'll deal with healthcare because it's the easiest one for me to talk about. I wrote a piece in Leo last week that argued that we actually do already have a single-payer healthcare system in America. It's just really poorly organized. Because if you take, with the exception of about 10 million individuals who are in the individual market but make too much money to get a government subsidy, premium subsidy through the ACA, everybody's health insurance is subsidized by the government, either directly or through the tax code. Because 160 million people who have employer-based insurance, they don't pay taxes on it, so they're subsidized, and then the employers get to deduct it. So I'm convinced that we need a single-payer model in this country that is organized much more efficiently. Because we're now spending roughly $10,000 per person on health care in this country every year. That's 320 million people's worth. And we can have a much better healthcare system with much less unfairness, much more consistent care and timely care if we were to organize it the way every other industrialized nation in the world does it. So that would be my vision of a new economic model.
And before we leave you, I just want to thank you for organizing what I think was the most effective town hall I had ever participated in this city, and probably that's been held anywhere else. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now, Dr. Bhatnagar. Bhatnagar, I apologize. With a name like Sadiqa, I owe it to you to get it right.
So I'm a scientist, so I'm going to speak for science. I think the first problem is we should need to take out economic models from the economists. We would save the economy from them, in the sense that they have a view of vision about the world that as if our wealth and our prosperity was static, and that they can make models and make predictions. The famous example is Malthus. He says, oh, your means of production of the earth, fruit growth is going to go very slowly, and population is going to grow very fast. In 50 years, there'll be no food left for anybody. right? That didn't come true because we changed means of production. We changed how we produce food. Just last month, there was a discovery out of Cambridge which said that they could modify the plants so they could generate 3 times the food that they do now. So we think that there's a large population of people, everybody's going to starve, and this is this horrendous situation. There is I have great faith in human inquiry that can save us from the most difficult of problems. But the part of the problem is as the Congressman is pointing out, maybe there is this sense of elitism that knowledge and understanding and inquiry and scientific questioning remains in these ivory towers and these elitist institutions. So a new model would be that we invest in in the thinkers and questioners and troublemakers and have them lead the country, not that these scientists in lab coats are answering questions, but kids from inner streets are asking, what are the species of plants in my neighborhood? How much is the ozone level? How come the water doesn't look like water? So if we have this sort of broad-based scientific inquiry based on an open, rational, liberal education, that's what's going to drive the economy further, not counting cents and dollars.
Excellent.
So as we get people coming up, I had a couple of, so policy has been mentioned a number of times. Sadiqa was talked about it, David and Kyle, and I even think the doctors talked about it. And when you talked about the GI Bill, Congressman, and I think it was a great policy, but it did not have the same impact for everybody who qualified for the GI Bill. So when we think about policy design is one thing, but the implementation of it. So how do we have an equitable policy agenda in the time and age that we're in? Learning from the past when we think about some of the policies that passed. And I think when you brought it up, David, when we talked about, now we want to have a public health conversation around what we're doing. Because I think when we talk about the heroin epidemic and the public health approach we're taking it on one side. We're taking it on those who are addicted to it and using it, but I believe those who are selling it are not going to have this public health approach, and we know that that's all connected. So just when we think about policy, how do we help the community and the elected officials do more equitable policy agendas?
You're looking for an answer.
Yeah, I don't know if there is one. I just want to put it out because I think when you mentioned the GI Bill, it struck me that when we look at that, it did build a middle class, but not for all of those that served. So we want to continue to not have that same conversation. So I don't know if there is an answer, but I just wanted to put it out.
But it ought to be a part of every discussion
Yes.
that we have about any policy we try to implement, right?
And I was just going to say, the professor earlier said, one word, education, and I think that the GI Bill, which obviously was about education and people coming in, and from my understanding was way larger than they expected when it was passed. That far, far more people took advantage of it, even though it was not even provided to the full breadth of those who were eligible. And New York State recently announcing free a version of free college tuition, and obviously that was a big part of the presidential campaign. But as we look at education, and even as we talk about, Ta-Nehisi Coates, this great author who has written beautiful books and articles, and one of his, initial breakout articles was about reparations, and although a scary topic for a lot of people when you look into it, he talked about Chicago and housing policies and redlining, but when we think about what is repayment, the biggest piece is really around education, right? If you look at, and to keep harping on my subject here around criminal justice, there was a study done in California, and I think this is probably true everywhere in the country, a study of state prison inmates, and it said the one thing they have in common more than anything else wasn't income level, wasn't ethnicity or race, wasn't where they came from, it was low educational achievement and attainment. More than anything else was pretty universal, right? And so if we think about the challenges of poverty and the cycle of poverty, this notion that education is, and higher education is not an entitlement or shouldn't be so incredibly expensive, but is the way, right? So there's this discussion of, well, we need UBI in the future, universal basic income because of automation. Really, we need universal health care, we need universal education.
So, yeah, absolutely.
We got somebody.
Go ahead, we do have someone with a question. Yes.
We got one on both
I think I
sides.
can reach the mic. Thank you for a really interesting session and all the different insights I've learned. I'm just passing through into Kentucky, actually, from the UK. Really interesting what you just mentioned then about basic income policy. I know that that's something that's being trialled, I think, at the moment in Finland, in Ontario. And as you mentioned just now, David, I wonder what the panel thinks about the idea of having basic income to kind of lift people out of that poverty.
I'll just say briefly, but I had a friend who I think the UBI thing is very interesting and to be explored. And there's a small pilot in Oakland that's being done out of a Silicon Valley foundation, a little different, but they're calling it a UBI experiment. I had a friend of mine who said, why when we're talking about doing this with the white community, it's UBI, but it's black people, it's welfare that's looked down upon. Regardless of that commentary, I think that it is, if we're getting to a point in 40 or 50 years where automation and globalization just really reduces the employment rate, then we have to look at what this other alternative economy is going to look like. And I think UBI is something that we really need to look at. I know in Denmark there is a larger kind of pilot of it. The numbers look untenable in America to give everybody, right, regardless of income. But it's something we have to begin certainly exploring.
Anybody else?
Yeah. I mean, one reason for the income equality was there was a limited amount of natural resources that were available, and the economy was based on natural resources, how much oil you could get and how much gold and silver and diamond. That's part of what made this country great, part of what made other parts of the world great. And there was a big fight, as you know, for many centuries about who's going to garner these natural resources.
And some of us think we're still fighting, but go ahead.
You're still fighting, yes, about. But the fight is different now. The most precious capital we have is not gold or silver or land or territory or mining or oil. It's people. And we have come into a different phase of economy where the human capital is so much more important than the raw earth. And so that is going to make the biggest difference and would, in the end, sort of overcome some of the disparity. The greatest wealth that the poor countries like China and India have is the wealth of people. And that, I think they are infinitely more precious than any gold and silver you can mine. But if they have to be educated and would channeled in the right direction, that we can bridge some of this income gap.
Yeah, I'd like that, and I would say that before we even get to UBI, if we could just start with a small step, which would be financing the gap for college for every student in America, making sure that in fact we are educating our population, I think is a tremendous step forward, and that is one of our biggest challenges, but it's something I think that we could fix very quickly if we put our minds to it. So we might be able to do that before we get to UBI. Yeah.
Let's go here, over here.
My question is for Congressman Yarmuth, who, as a citizen of the 3rd District of Kentucky, I want to thank you for being, in the context of our opening poem, becoming a problem in Washington, D.C.
Keep being a problem.
As my friend John Lewis says, getting into good trouble.
That's right. Albeit a very soft-spoken, thoughtful, and well-informed problem, but keep it up. I know you to be, and also as a representative of the medical community who endeavors to remain compassionate, I know you're very well informed about health insurance, and I'd like to return just for a second to that issue. Whether it's called dynamic scoring or the cost of not being compassionate, not delivering health care to every citizen in this country has enormous costs, and I think you're well aware of the magnitude of those. But when I hear your colleagues in Washington, D.C. speaking, they're talking only about the cost to the federal budget. It's like one counted only the investments that they make without ever looking at the return on investment, be it good, average, or poor. This is a perfect example where a relatively large investment would have enormous financial benefits in addition to the compassionate benefits. Would you speak to that?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that point was in my notes, which I didn't make at the time. that we have to stop thinking about things just in terms of their impact on the federal budget. Much of what the debate in Kentucky on expanded Medicaid has been related to what the impact on the state budget is. That's Governor Bevin's perspective on it. How much is this going to cost the state treasury? Whereas Governor Beshear looked at the big picture. What's this going to mean in terms of employment statewide? What's it going to mean in overall health outcomes? How much does that save us down the road because people are getting preventive care and so forth? So he looked at it in a much bigger perspective. So you're absolutely right that we have to broaden our perspective on this. But you said it, and I don't think I can say it any better. I think the reaction in this room, the reaction last night when I talked about single payer at the Bernie Sanders rally, people get it, that this is something that we as a nation have pretty much decided that healthcare, quality healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and that if the states aren't going to provide it for our citizens, if the private sector can't, which we know it can't, then the federal government has to organize it in such a way that everybody has it. So, I can't imagine anything we could do that would be more important. You think about the Constitution and what it mandated the government do: provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty. Promoting the general welfare is a pretty significant cover for universal health care.
Thank you very much.
Hello, I have compassion on my brother who spoke before me, even though I'm standing here. Thank you. One of the most untapped, compassionate Medicare benefits since the 1980s is hospice care. And so I guess it's probably directed more toward the Congressman, but I'm from Cincinnati. I've been a hospice chaplain for 12 years. In 2009, there were 10 hospices in Cincinnati, and now in 2017, there are 22 hospices. I'm sure Louisville probably has more hospices now than they did in 2009. I have no idea, but our population is aging and aging and aging. And so I think the hospice world wants to know, with the budgets and Meals on Wheels being taken away, and how is that going to affect hospice when all of us are going to die? And all of us, once, a lot of people come on hospice in the last 3 days of their life. But hospice really can be utilized. We've had patients now that have been on 3 and 4 years, not abusing it. They just haven't passed away, but they've had a continual decline. Anyway, part of my question is what's the future of hospice? When many, I'd say in the last 2 years, a lot of the patients that I'm doing ministry with in chaplaincy are actually 40 to 50 years old, and they're now dying from addiction, alcoholism. They've had the Narcan so many times in the last 6 months that now they're on hospice. And so there's a lot of spiritual questions with that, regret, but also the Meals on Wheels tie. There are many hospice patients I visit that if they don't have Meals on Wheels, they're going to die a lot faster. So I would love to ask that congressman or that person that made that quote, has he ever had a dying person in his life who was hungry? Because that's a great question.
But this is Mick Mulvaney's problem, and I may have mentioned, Mick's a friend of mine. We don't agree on anything, but he's a friend of mine. Mick's problem is he thinks about everything in ideological terms. That's all government means to him, is kind of a manifestation of a certain ideology, and it doesn't. So he was asked. I don't want to get too much of a tangent on him, but he was on television last week, and he was asked about why they thought it was important to try and revive the repeal and replace legislation in Congress. And he gave 3 reasons. One of them was to gain political momentum. The second one was to make it easier to do tax reform. And I forget what the third one was, but none of them had anything to do with the health of the American people, right. Which to me was one of the most mind-boggling responses to a question, why do you need to do health care legislation that had nothing to do with health? So, but going back to hospice, now you're getting in the political arena into one of the most dangerous areas you can possibly enter. And we tried to deal with this in the Affordable Care Act when we wrote the provision, and I was working on it with Earl Blumenauer from Oregon, who wrote it, which became the death panel provision. And all it said was that the provision authorized payment by Medicare for a doctor to have a consultation with a patient about end-of-life options. Wasn't mandatory, just said if you want to have that conversation with your doctor, the doctor can be reimbursed for it. One time in 4 years or something like that. That became death panels. So when we're talking about anything that kind of, in terms of promoting hospice, then you all of a sudden in some circles it will be twisted, you're promoting, assisted suicide. So it's a very tough one. All we're trying to do is hold on to the funding under current law to make sure that, that people have that option.
And let me offer this really basic answer. Having served as Inspector General regulated healthcare in this state, I think oftentimes those who are in the position of elected official are voting on things that they don't see as impacting them. So if you really think about it, when you think about hospice, which is tremendously important, it is about dignity and death. And I think those were the words that you used. It seems to me that often we are having folks vote against our dignity. There is no, so because they will have dignity in their death, because they have enough, there seems to be no concern for the rest of us. And so that is why these things don't really seem to be valued. And that's what I think we have to constantly highlight and push back against.
So we've got about 4 more minutes, and if we can get the last 3 questions all together and then just let the panel respond to them. So if we can do that, I know we've got 2 on this side and we got 1 here, so these will be our last 3 questions. You want to start us off, sir?
Well, I'll go very quickly then. My question is for David. In relation to the economics of incarceration, it does seem that we have areas where profit motive drives incarceration rates and spaces that are populated by private for-profit prisons. And I know you broke out, state versus local versus federal and everything, but could you speak to that a little bit about the economic driver of incarceration?
Yeah.
Hold on, let's get the other 2 real quick. That's for you though, David.
I want to speak to prevention. I think, David, we have the cartel here in Louisville. They just arrested somebody who was connected with the cartel, and that's why we have an increase in death, because we do have and what are the laws doing about that? Also, I think that we have laws that have created your Johnny up there, whoever he was, because they paid for so many years, all these women for all these different programs, so they chased the men away. And so these were immoral laws. Now, what are you talking about when you talk about compassion? Mr. Yarmuth, what kind of compassion? Is it moral compassion? I think we need moral compassion in Washington, because I was an educator for many years, and the children who do the best are from intact families. We need laws for no-fault divorce. It's horrendous. We have immoral pollution. 1/3 of our population has sexually transmitted diseases. That's 100 million people. Talk about pollution. Horrific. This is horrific. We need moral laws that are being passed. And also, if in a very healthy environment as a farm, we have so many farms in Kentucky right now because people are 60 and over, they're retiring. But there's no incentive in Washington. Where are the laws that you're passing? Where are the tax incentives for these young people to take their families to these farms? The people that are buying them are the rich people that you were talking about, the 1%. They're buying the farms in Kentucky. And they're mass producing, they're reselling them at horrific, wonderful profits. So where are the laws, Mr. Yarmuth? Where are the moral laws that will help our communities?
Can we get 1 more point from you before we move on? Were you good?
Yep.
Well, that's...
Where are the moral laws, right?
Right.
Thank you. Yep.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I have a question that probably doesn't have a good answer. So much of what we talk about doesn't so much revolve around knowing what's the right thing to do, because we all know what's the right thing to do. It revolves around the economic repercussions and implications of what we do. And when the things that we've talked about today, improving health care, improving environmental qualities so people have a better quality of life, keeping people out of jail, those are issues that have a more diffuse result they have a result that benefits society as a whole. So I'm benefited if Jimmy doesn't go to jail because he took the briefcase. But I don't see that physically in my life. I can't look at my checkbook and say, oh, here's my benefit. I got $5 because Johnny didn't go to jail. So people who can do the abstract reasoning to say, here's what the costs are of how we do things, and here's the benefits of doing something differently, okay, I see why that works. I'm on board. Well, what do we do with the large segment of our population which does not really seem to be very interested or able to do a lot of abstract reasoning? And they're much more influenced by what they see on television or what they read on a alternative news website, let's say. It'd be different if we were operating at a budget surplus in our country, because then we could say, hey, for every 1,000 fewer people we have in prison, we're going to give everyone in the country $100. We're running a deficit. So what can we do to make the benefits of these compassionate social changes more apparent to the average voter who only has one vote? The people who are orchestrating most of our laws and regulations have very good ideas of what benefits them and what benefits their constituents who make campaign donations. But what can we do to make this more obvious to the person who's really going to be benefited?
Yeah, you can start. Yep.
So I'm going to answer the last one, then you can go ahead with that. So what do we do with people who are not abstractly grasping the complexity? And there is a very old story we talk about faith. It's about an old story from the Hindu, and the Lord Shiva made the world, and then his wife Parvati came to her and he said, God, you made this world. There are some people who are these rational, thinkers, and they can think and meditate and know the complexities of the world. What about the rest of the world, the 90%? So Shiva said, well, they can just sing and dance. But there's truth to that. There's truth to that. What we have to do is, if we cannot convince people rationally, and we shouldn't leave no stone unturned, is to write poems about it, make movies about them, to convey to people on a human level what it is to grow up in poverty, what it is to be an abused parent, and what it is that makes a difference to a human life that you can relate to. And that was part of the things that have made a difference. We couldn't have legislated equality or gay rights unless we put the shows on television, every show has a gay person in it. So if we are in a participatory democracy, it is not economics alone, but persuading people by our creative activities and convincing them what it means to be a human being in that particular condition.
So I'll say a couple things very quickly. So I was going to say storytelling. We've got to do a better job at storytelling. I like data, I like numbers. That doesn't move people, unfortunately. I don't know why. But we've got to do a better job with storytelling, hence I talked about Johnny. And so I have a friend, Scott Budnick. He was executive producer of the largest grossing comedy in the history of America, the Hangover movie. He is now reformed, and he has dedicated his life to telling stories around criminal justice reform, and has a new production company about to start doing that. And so storytelling. To the issue of the income and the profit moral issue, or lack of moral issue, is yes. So private prisons has been a growth industry in America. And companies like Jail Group and Correctional Corporation of America, which are publicly traded, and you can buy stock in prison, and these are horribly and horrifically run institutions. And so if you want to, cry yourself to sleep at night, there's a long but great article in Mother Jones a few months ago. A reporter who went to, I think it was Louisiana, and got a job as a correctional officer in a private prison. They didn't know he was a reporter, and he spent several months there and then wrote about it. It's just horrifying. But the caution here is private prisons really grew as a reform. Right, the federal government said, we can't do this. correctly. We're messing up. We have we're horribly run prisons. We need to, business knows how to do it. And then you had the profit margin, right? So you give a block amount of money, and they're going to figure out how to do it for the least amount of money possible in order to increase profit. And so now, the one thing I'll say about that is it's one of the more horrifying things to talk about, but quite honestly, it is a small portion of the people who are in prison, to be honest, right? The other profit margin, which is jobs, is much more difficult for us liberals to deal with, to be honest, because the people who often oppose the reform to reduce the size of the system are our friends in public unions, right? And that's just something we have to grapple with, right? And so correction unions often fight reforms. Teacher unions fight some education reforms. And so I think that we have to start off with a base of teachers, people who do, primarily teachers, but also correctional officers, they need to earn a good wage and have good benefits and protections, and let's just all agree with that, but then let's talk about reforming the systems as well. That was it.
Just add a couple things. One is civics education. This is in relation to the last question. They did a poll during the campaign last year, so this is very timely. 47% of the American people did not think that Medicare was a government program. 35% of Americans didn't think Social Security was. So we have a basic lack of fundamental understanding of what the government does and doesn't do. That's not an easy one. I've said for years, we don't know how in this country anymore to have a thoughtful discussion about complicated issues.
Yeah.
We've got to figure out how to do that. I don't have the answer. As to the question of morality, this is pretty dicey when you get into public policy making. The most obvious dichotomy is those people who are anti-abortion and pro-death penalty, both on a moral position. I think every decision I make has a moral component to it, but it's my morality, and it may not be yours. So I prefer to think of compassion rather than morality, because morality is something that, again, gets into areas that really, everybody in Washington thinks that their morality informs their decision, and sincerely believes that. And I don't doubt it.
Well, I do.
Good ending note.
What about, greed is good, right? There are people who believe that the profit motive is a high moral value.
Yeah. Well, this has really been wonderful. There's some things that I just wanted to say very quickly before we go. Being the only woman up here, I feel like I have to certainly represent. So I think when I heard you talk about, corrections officers, I think about our need to really move more toward a social worker model in the correctional facility, so that it really is one that is correctional, so that people have an opportunity to be really rehabilitated, because you pointed out and the statistics show that the system is just simply not working for us as it is. I think to the question of morality, which I'm trying desperately to find the compassion in myself as I listened, because I think it is interesting for someone and for people who sometimes seem to be so very outraged by things like, and I think it was mentioned, STDs and all of this, but then this idea of seeing people murdered on television day in and day out, really finding no response to that. And I am wondering about, and I said this to someone who happened to knock on my door the other night, where is your God when you see these things happening? Why is your heart not pierced? Where is the push for the change? And I think that that's what we have to think about. I also want to say something about economic policy, really. We have released, and other cities could do this very easily, a redlining report. And when you look at redlining and what was done in communities and how people could not invest. If there was a leak in the roof, they could not do what most of us now could do, hopefully get a loan for our houses or equity line or whatever, could not sell, could not buy in certain areas. And then we look at those same communities and wonder, how did they get that way? We see the reports that were written in our lifetimes. Right. But we make no effort to redirect in a very real way dollars that can change that community. And not from a charitable perspective, but this is what is owed. It is the policy and the laws that have broken our community. But we don't really talk about, thank you, the fix and moving and investing in a different way. So I think for all of us to think about compassion, most of all in the policy. We all have the ability to change policy. We all have the ability to pick up the phone or write a letter to our congressman or our senator. And especially I think when you can say, I voted for you, and this is not what I expected. This is not what I expected. This is not how I want to be represented. I think we have an obligation to do that. And there is an obligation to educate ourselves and not to assume that we know so much about all of these things, but really to educate ourselves on how we can fix the world that we broke. Nature, as you said earlier, nature just simply won't bend to your will. So it is us. We are the ones who have to bend. And when and how far will we go?
Let's thank this panel.
Okay, let's offer one more big, huge round of applause and thanks to our entire panel. So I was sitting there thinking, how am I going to close out this session? But fortunately, I don't have to because we have 3 minutes of silence following my announcements. So I'll offer that one of the things I think we must all do is stay present and be present here in this moment with the conversation we've just heard. And as you think about some of the activities going on in the lobby, there are more opportunities to kind of tap into that presence. So check out the sand mandala if you haven't already. Check out the chalk art installation that will, at the end of the week, also be washed away if you haven't already. Join us in the lobby for a couple of book signings. We have the phenomenal Hannah Drake, who will be signing her books. We also have Rabbi Rami Shapiro, who will be signing some of his books. We have a reception for you all, and we hope you'll stick around, and hopefully some of our panelists will be able to stay and meet and greet and mingle in the lobby as well, so we encourage you to take advantage of that. And I'll just make a note, if you're here this morning, you heard about our commitment to hosting zero waste events, so you'll notice that there are some cups out there that look like they're plastic, but they're compostable. So help us meet our goal of being zero waste by using the bins that are located throughout the lobby and ask if you have any questions. Many staff are here to assist you. We're so grateful that you're here. And then just an announcement that we found some keys. So check your pockets, your bags. If you are missing keys, come find me. I have them. And, of course, last but not least, we have an incredible celebration planned for this evening. I'm going to go ahead and say it's going to be epic. We will be leaving the Kentucky Center for our evening program. It will be held at the Cathedral of the Assumption, which is at 523rd South 5th Street, just a few blocks south of where we are here right now. We have an evening program curated by Ambassador Shabazz, featuring local choirs. We have Ann Curry as our keynote speaker, and a local group called Lincoln Bridge. Some of you might have heard of them before. So don't miss the party and the celebration that starts at 5:30. I would encourage you to arrive early. It's a free event, no tickets required, just show up. So if you want a really good seat, get there early. Am I missing anything else? Okay. So we have our traditional 3 minutes of silence.